Hello, Lobbert here. Please consider giving this video a like and subscribe for more Pauper Commander content. If you'd like to support what I'm doing here, I'd love it if you became a patron. I've been trying to mentally gear up to make a video on lands and building a mana base in PDH, which is going to be a huge amount of work, and I started to think about the cards that influence how you build it, and there's one that I started to worry would greatly increase the length of the video, and I really wanted to express all of my thoughts on it. It's a card that I think is underplayed, and that might be an unpopular opinion. The card is Arcum's Astrolabe. Arcum's Astrolabe is an artifact that costs a single snow mana and says, when Arcum's Astrolabe enters the battlefield, draw a card. It also has an ability with the cost of 1 and tap to add 1 mana of any color. If you're not familiar with this unassuming mana filter already, it's been banned in several 60-card formats, yet people still say that it doesn't do anything and exclude it from their decks. The fact that they're not running it is highlighted with Arcum's Astrolabe because if someone isn't running Snow Basics, you know they're not playing it, so it's easy to look around and find people that aren't playing it that probably should. I'll admit that it's probably being excluded from decks partially because of its price point. While the card itself isn't very costly, a full set of Snow Basics add up pretty quickly, especially when you consider that most players have many decks, and Arcum's Astrolabe can be in almost any of those. Many players don't play it because they think that they have to have some additional synergy to make it worth it, but the card has been banned in multiple formats, and not only because the decks that were playing it were recurring it, many just used it for the fixing. In Wizards' modern ban announcement on July 13th, 2020, they said, while these problem decks have taken several forms, their common game plan is using Arcum's Astrolabe to play powerful cards across several colors. As a result, Arcum's Astrolabe has become one of the most played cards in Modern. In 60-card formats, it simply brings the cost of playing decks that are 3 or 4 colors down too low. Only costing 1 allows you to play it with mana you don't plan to use anyway much of the time, and it's card neutral, so the cost to play it is very low. The ban announcement goes on to reinforce that the cost is too low by saying, Arcum's Astrolabe makes this trade-off come at too low of a cost, as one Arcum's Astrolabe can often mean excellent mana for the rest of the game without costing a card. In addition, Arcum's Astrolabe leads to other synergy by virtue of being a cheap artifact permanent, and it can be blinked or recurred for card advantage. In short, Arcum's Astrolabe adds too much to these decks for too little cost, resulting in win rates that are unhealthy and unsustainable for the metagame. Almost a year and a half later, this card would be banned in Legacy for doing the same thing. It allowed players to play the best cards across 4 colors, but the twist with Legacy is that the cost wasn't the life you saved in Modern by playing less shocks or not entering tapped like in Pauper. In Legacy, it was because playing Snow Basics dodges Wasteland and Blood Moon, which usually punish greedy mana bases. The Pauper ban announcement stated, because of the nature of the Pauper card pool, reliable multicolor mana bases have been historically a challenge for many decks. Arcum's Astrolabe greatly changes this dynamic, as the clear, easiest, and strongest choice for color fixing. As many decks would adopt Arcum's Astrolabe purely for color fixing anyway, it becomes quote-unquote free to gain additional value from it being a cheap artifact and card advantage engine. To some degree, the metagame has shifted towards selecting for the best Arcum's Astrolabe deck. It then goes on to say how the decks that were already running Glinthawk, Core Skyfisher, Ephemerate, and other cards abused it in other ways. I bring up the Pauper ban last because the synergies in Pauper with Arcum's Astrolabe were so strong that I think it detracted from my point that the card was played even when it was just to provide mana fixing, because it does so for so little cost. I know that in Modern and Legacy, this was because they enabled 4-color decks, but in Pauper, the best deck was a blue-white Ephemerate deck that only splashed red for Scred. Having more colors in Pauper is just more costly because our mana fixing lands come in tapped. I think that's reinforced by how much sooner Arcum's Astrolabe was banned in Pauper. It was banned around a year before it would be banned in other formats. To me, that means if we extrapolate this to a format with even worse color fixing and higher variance than a 60-card format like Pauper Commander does, the bar must be pretty low for how many colors you need to be running to justify playing Arcum's Astrolabe. As Wizards put it in the modern ban announcement, to have excellent mana for the rest of the game. It's really mind-blowing to me that there are 3-color decks that attest to being competitive that don't run Astrolabe. I really don't like it when people gatekeep competitive formats by saying this or that isn't competitive, so I wanted to make it clear that I'm not saying that if you don't run Arcum's Astrolabe in every deck that's 3 or more colors, your deck isn't competitive. Any deck that you would feel comfortable entering a tournament with is competitive. It just may not be optimal in my eyes, because I think Arcum's Astrolabe is optimal a lot of the time. Even 2-color decks in Pauper Commander should be running it. The cost for including Arcum's Astrolabe in other formats like Modern and Legacy is arguably higher. Legacy and Modern decks have access to real fetch lands, shocks, and duels, which they must balance to ensure that they'll have snow mana to play Arcum's Astrolabe, but Pauper fetch lands only find basics, which will be snow lands, and there are even tapped dual lands that have the snow type that you should most likely be running anyway, and unlike EDH, there aren't enough non-basic lands in Pauper that are worth running to affect your ability to play Arcum's Astrolabe, because again, non-basics usually enter tapped. which you really want to limit, and even if the non-basic lands Pauper has access to enter untapped, they usually produce colorless mana. Bringing that back to how it relates to 2-color decks, most 2-color decks run between 6 and 10 tapped lands, and if Arkham's Astrolabe can justify cutting one additional tap land, that's a big victory. 60-card formats also end a lot quicker than most Pauper Commander games, so when players think that it's a waste of mana, I really wonder how they think that Modern and Legacy players can justify it, but they can't. If you compare Arkham's Astrolabe to Pauper fetch lands, it acts more like a dual land than a basic, because if you're forced to tap down to a single mana source, Arkham's Astrolabe lets you filter into any color, and even lets you use a colorless source to do it. It can also be played on the same turn that you play another land, which makes it even better than a tapped fetch land. I've even considered putting Arkham's Astrolabe in some monocolor decks because I'm running a lot of colorless sources, and I know that I'm going to have some very color-intensive turns, especially in black, where Crypt Rats and Pestilence are extremely common, and directly reward you for having perfect mana. And if that's my stance for how strong Arkham's Astrolabe can be in a monocolor deck with Crypt Rats and Pestilence, you should be able to figure out what I think about 2-color decks that run these sweepers, and not Arkham's Astrolabe. Black also has a lot of other powerful cards that can sacrifice artifacts for value, such as Costly Plunder, Reckoner's Bargain, Deadly Dispute, and Fanatical Offering, where Arkham's Astrolabe being a cheap card-neutral artifact turns straight into cards in your hand. Importantly, all of these spells are instant, which allows for even more value if you're sacrificing chump blockers, and it allows you to hold up interaction. Black also has the most powerful equipment in Pauper, one so powerful that it's been banned since the inception of 60-card Pauper: Cranial Blading. Cranial Blading doesn't need a lot of help to allow you to deal some serious damage, but Arkham's Astrolabe doesn't require very much from us either, and I think it's effortless synergy like this that is at the heart of what makes the best decks the best. Candy Grapple and Rowan's Grim Search allow you to sacrifice Arkham's Astrolabe to bargain, and each have very respectable abilities without it. If we compare other 2-mana instants like Candy Grapple to it, Last Gasp and Tragic Fall also give -3/-3, but Last Gasp doesn't have an additional benefit, and Tragic Fall's Hellbent ability might not be as easy to achieve as simply having Arkham's Astrolabe or another disposable artifact or token in play. Grasp of Darkness gives -4/-4, but it costs double black, which also just makes me want to slap Arkham's Astrolabe into the deck. Black also just tends to be one of the most color-intensive pieces of the color pie. Rowan's Grim Search is also better than the other 3-mana draw spells in black. Most of the ones with extra benefits, like the Scry on Read the Bones, or the Blood token from Pointed Discussions, are sorceries, which is a major drawback, so comparing them to the other instant speed draw spells for 3 mana in black, we find Blood Pact, which has no other text other than drawing 2 cards and losing 2 life, and Succumb to Temptation, which is the same, but more color intensive. Rowan's Grim Search can be used without bargain, but it really digs so deep, just by having an extra Arkham's Astrolabe laying around. Final Flourish only gives -2/-2, which falls short of Candy Grapple's -3/-3, but you can also sacrifice non-token creatures, and it gives the creature -6/-6 instead of Candy Grapple's -5/-5. But I don't think you need to be comparing these two to see which one you should include in your deck. I think that many black decks can support playing both of these. We've already named 10 cards that can go in almost any black deck: 5 draw spells, 2 targeted removal spells, and 2 sweepers. Add about 10 mana rocks, Arkham's Astrolabe, and some other solid cards like Tithing Blade and Blood Fountain, and we're already 23 cards into the deck, and we don't even know what the commander is yet. Which makes me think that black decks in PDH have reached the point that 60-card Pauper decks did when Arkham's Astrolabe was banned, where, quote, "To some degree, the metagame has shifted towards selecting for the best Arkham's Astrolabe deck. To be clear, I don't think that the best deck in the format is currently a Black Eggs deck. The most popular and winning archetype according to the data that Clay and Puzzlebox discussed in their recent discussion video was Combo, so you're probably better off choosing your deck based on a combo. Their data also shows that black is the least winning color, but I think that this archetype is one that needs more exploring. In fact, I recently combined this information to build a competitive Sphinx Summoner list that I've only begun testing, but it's won 3 of the 4 games I've played with it so far, so Black Egg seems very strong to me, but I'm not here to sell you an entire archetype or a specific color. I'm here for Arkham's Astrolabe. Even if you don't run these specific cards, Arkham's Astrolabe still adds a lot of consistency to your deck, both fixing mana and essentially allowing you to play a 99-card deck, meaning you'll get your good cards more often. There are also times when your opponent plays something like Ulamog's Crusher. Annihilator makes the defending player sacrifice permanents, and I promise that it feels way better to sacrifice Arkham's Astrolabe than a land. Fadeaway also works really well with Arkham's Astrolabe. Whether you cast it or an opponent does, Fadeaway is worded, "For each creature, its controller sacrifices a permanent unless they pay 1. The important part of Fadeaway is that if you don't pay, you can sacrifice any permanent, not just the creatures. So Arkham's Astrolabe can save you mana and creatures here. Speaking of blue, It also has Perilous Research, which is a strictly better costly plunder because it allows you to sacrifice a permanent instead of just a creature or artifact. This allows it to be generically good and slot into a lot of different decks. Blue also has Trinket Mage, which usually searches for artifact lands, spell bombs, or combo pieces, so it can also fit into decks that aren't going all in on artifacts, and having one more option in being able to look for Arkham's Astrolabe with Trinket Mage doesn't hurt. There are also cards in blue that care about having artifacts in play, but aren't worth including in your deck unless you're making artifacts a major part of your game plan, such as Thoughtcast, Filigree Attendant, and Reverse Engineer. But I'm more interested in discussing why average decks should run it, not just the ones that already have an artifact synergy, so I'd prefer to talk about something like Moonsnare Prototype. With Arkham's Astrolabe in play, Moonsnare Prototype refunds the mana used to cast it, although it's colorless afterward. But even then, if you're able to tap something else to activate Moonsnare Prototype, Arkham's Astrolabe can help fix that mana for you too. Mana rocks that cost 1 don't really exist, except for this, Springleaf Drum, and Soul Ring. Soul Ring isn't legal in this format, and is busted in every format it's playable in, and Springleaf Drum only taps for creatures, which is a huge drawback when there are so many things like treasures and Arkham's Astrolabe that are begging to be tapped. But not only is Moonsnare Prototype ramp, it's a removal spell, although an expensive one. It's at least instant speed, isn't conditional, and can't be targeted by counterspell though. Moonsnare Prototype can also be searched for with Trinket Mage, which lets both of these cards slot into more decks. Arkham's Astrolabe also serves as a secondary target for Ghostly Flicker that's harder to remove than a creature most of the time, so it's generally safer. Planar Incision is another flicker that works with Arkham's Astrolabe, but targeting it would be more of an act of desperation, since you mostly want to target creatures to get the +1/+1 counter. It doesn't hurt to have the option though, and I know that I've had to do it more than once before. In red, the card that works well with Arkham's Astrolabe that jumps to my mind is Skred. Arkham's Astrolabe is a snow permanent, so it helps Skred scale. That's not the strongest synergy, but Skred is one of the best removal spells, so you're probably already running it, and Snowlands, so you're already most of the way there to playing Arkham's Astrolabe. Red also has Demand Answers. Allowing you to discard a card instead of sacrificing an artifact makes it consistent enough to play in almost any red deck, and Arkham's Astrolabe is great free fuel. That also makes it instant speed card advantage in red, which is pretty hard to come by. Makeshift Munitions is another card that's already included in many decks. It's a great repeatable source of removal. It allows you to sacrifice artifacts in addition to creatures, so Arkham's Astrolabe is cheap and card neutral fuel. Red, like all the other colors, has cards that reward you if you include enough artifacts that you can rely on it. Some particularly strong ones that I want to highlight are Reckless Fireweaver and Penregan Strongbull, that can deal a lot of damage to the table. There are cards across many colors, like Core Skyfisher, Aviary Mechanic, Stockpiling Celebrant, and Indoctrination Attendant in white, Dreamstalker in blue, and an Invasive Species in green that allow you to return Arkham's Astrolabe or something else to your hand that can allow you to re-trigger your Enter the Battlefield abilities, which is applicable to a wide variety of strategies. If you consider how many cards you really need to support the strategy, it's really not that many. All of your creatures with Enters the Battlefield abilities support it, Arkham's Astrolabe does too, and Abundant Growth is another 1-mana spell that can be a redraw. What really elevates this strategy is when you include Journey to Nowhere, Oblivion Ring, and Alabaster Host Intercessor. These are very good sorcery speed removal spells that work best when pointed at commanders, because most players will put their commanders back in the command zone, because if they don't, they risk losing access to their commander for the rest of the game, and because they're no longer in exile, picking up these Journey to Nowhere style effects to replay them can give white decks some extra much needed removal, which is something I've been experimenting with in my Thraben Watcher deck after I made a deck tech on it. Recommission is another white card that is included in many decks that already gets better with Arkham's Astrolabe. This is another small synergy, but it can work if you're desperate for a target and are able to dump Arkham's Astrolabe into the graveyard off of Takacia's Dig Site, a discard spell, or any other random things that happen during a game. My point is really that Arkham's Astrolabe works with a lot of popular cards in advantageous ways, and as a floor, it's a very cheap spell that will help your mana. I also want to look at Arkham's Astrolabe through both a casual and competitive lens. In casual, an argument I've frequently heard against playing it is that it doesn't matter if their deck isn't optimal, because it's a casual deck. While this is true, the reason I play it in most of my casual decks is that I'm not trying to optimize for power level. I'm trying to optimize for play experience, and not having colors and not getting the cards you need are both things that can ruin a game. Arkham's Astrolabe hopes both of these things by thinning your deck and giving you excellent mana. In competitive, players more often argue that there's simply no room for it in the deck, which is hard to argue with a lot of the time because competitive lists get streamlined to an extreme and slots get tight pretty quickly. But I would argue that Arkham's Astrolabe should be included to streamline your deck further and make it as consistent as possible. Remember, this card was banned out of multiple 60-card formats, even Legacy, where it was primarily banned for mana fixing for too low of a cost. Truth be told though, there are situations where you shouldn't use Arkham's Astrolabe. For example, if you play something like Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator as your commander, and you play dominantly blue sources, the treasures that Malcolm generates can easily get you through a game, so the color fixing aspect of Arkham's Astrolabe may not be as needed. There are also lists that are tight on mana, and have synergies with hundreds of cards, so their worst card is still very good, so they don't want it either. I know that this is a lot for one card, but I think that the efforts are worth it, because Arkham's Astrolabe can go in any deck. So this video has a good chance of helping a lot of people. I also know that this is a divisive topic. Some people don't ever think it's worth putting in anything. Out of curiosity, I looked at the top 500 most viewed Pauper Commander decks in Moxfield, and 10% of those decks play Arkham's Astrolabe. That's a fair amount when you consider that many of the decks aren't running it because of budget reasons or haven't been updated since the printing of some of these artifact synergies. That's a decent chunk of the meta that think Arkham's Astrolabe are worth it too. I also looked at the top 50 most viewed decks on Moxfield, and 30% of them were running Arkham's Astrolabe. That's probably due to Dargo and Abdel being heavily represented in that group, so it may not mean much, but I thought it was interesting, and it makes me think back to the 60-card Pauper ban announcement, where people were selecting for the best Arkham's Astrolabe deck. Anyway, I've talked about one card for way too long, so let's wrap this up. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you have a reason for or against playing Arkham's Astrolabe that I didn't discuss, please leave it in the comments below. Please also consider giving this video a like, and subscribe for more Pauper Commander content. If you'd like to support what I'm doing here, I'd love it if you became a patron. Patreon shoutout to Achu, Dax, and Bill, Too Much Do. Thank you. When I need players for my Monday Pauper Commander streams, I use the Looking for Group channel on the Common Connoisseurs Discord to find additional players. It's free to join, so even if you don't plan to find games there, I still recommend joining. It's just a great place to talk about competitive Pauper Commander.